Without further ado, Janjira.
Hi, afternoon, morning, evening, everyone, wherever you are. First of all, I'd like to thank Alex and the AIS team for making this event possible. It's unfortunate that I couldn't be there in person despite all the prep, but you know, that's another topic in itself. And so without further ado, let me start by sharing with you this story. In November last year, at least 17 persons in Thailand received an alert from Apple that their phones were being targeted, basically hacked and spied by state-sponsored attackers. And this year, to follow up with this investigation, advocacy groups like ILO, Domestic NGO, and Citizen Lab from Canada discovered altogether 30 Apple devices infected with the spyware called Pegasus. And we can talk about Pegasus all day, but today is not about the technicality of how spyware works. But so most targets, and interestingly, turn out to be key activists, academics, and opposition politicians who were in one way or another involved in anti-government protests in 2020 and 2021. And so what's striking is that these figures have undergone, at the same time as being spied by government, have undergone various forms of repression, both on and offline. Events like this have driven my current research, which looks at the relationship between digital repression and resistance movements. What I'd like to share with you today are some of my thoughts on how governments use digital and technological tools for repression and how this undermines nonviolent resistance campaigns. Most importantly, based on this analysis, I want to nudge all of us working in the field of nonviolent resistance to rethink key insights in the existing literature in our field regarding repression. And to illustrate this concern, I will draw my analysis on digital repression in Thailand that has intensified in the aftermath of the protest last year and 2020. Now, just let me quickly revisit what nonviolent resistance scholars have said about how strategic nonviolence can counter repression. In a nutshell, state and sometimes non-state actors repress movements through coercive means in order to deter activities that challenge the status quo. Right, and repression is often imagined in this literature in terms of security forces using lethal and less than lethal weapons to disperse protesters on the streets, for example, and other violent aspects of repression, for example, forced disappearance, assassination, so on and so forth. And so while some scholars argue that the repression can deter and demobilize, and as you can see, this first pathway, repression can deter and demobilize movements, others contend that it can actually escalate the resistance. And so here we enter the persistent debate on deterrence and escalation effects of repression. Now, for our purpose today, nonviolent resistance research stands on the side of escalation effects, basically saying that movements can turn repression to their advantage by doing a few things. Number one, they could frame the event of repression as an insult to injustice and therefore further mobilize supporters against the oppressors or the regime. Second, in light of violent crackdown on nonviolent protests, movements should retain their nonviolent discipline to highlight regime's brutality. and therefore conducive to declining public support. It can also activate defection within security forces and to draw international attention to the resistance movement. And so I'm not going into detail about this literature, but these are the key arguments that actually mainstream findings so far about how nonviolent resistance can actually reverse the effects of repression. And now, what I want to bring to light today is that underpinning these insights is the association of repression with the use of violence force as a means of control. Okay, this association, the use of violent force as a means of control and repression. And despite the merits of this argument, the assumption became untenable when the notion of repression is not limited to only the use of violent force, but includes various forms of social and cultural controls to discipline the population at large, and most importantly, to redirect as well as disrupt movements from within. Digital repression yields exactly these effects of control. And I would argue later that digital repression works to control by exercising panoptic, punitive, and framing powers. And so the following parts of my talk will elaborate on these points through the case of Thailand. Now, a little bit on digital repression before we discuss further about the Thai case. Digital repression overlaps with and extends from traditional repression, denoting the use of information and communication technology to survey, coerce, and manipulate individuals or groups to achieve repressive goals. Forms of this kind of repression that have been studied so far include, first, digital repression, which comprises two forms, targeted repression and targeted and passive surveillance. The former targeted surveillance is exemplified by the use of interception technologies and spyware like Pegasus that I mentioned before. And passive surveillance includes the use of manpower or artificial intelligence to monitor social media content, for example. The second form, I will not go into detail again. I think the Thai case will elaborate how these forms of digital repression works. So the second form is content restriction, either through web blocks or takedown requests. The third form includes the use of computer, cyber, or information-related laws to prosecute individual dissidents. The fourth toolkit is government-sponsored cyber troops. These are units of people who engage in online influence campaigns, at times in order to spread misinformation. Last but not least, some governments opt for shutting down the internet partially or fully. Digital repression can undermine resistance movements in various ways. First, sophisticated technologies can harness massive amounts of data produced in digital space. So whenever we log in, for example, we always leave what is called behavioral data, how much time we spend on a website, what clicks do we press, and the likes that we press, things like that. So these are all behavioral data that can be harnessed, collected, and analyzed. So this makes surveillance more extensive and cost-effective. Second, and relatedly, the use of artificial intelligence for surveillance allows governments to identify threats more precisely and predictively. The key is predictability of the future, yeah? And this in turn enables the deterrence of dissenting activism before it escalates. So we can think about China and all of technology being used there in order to predict behaviors and put police force in place before protests can even take place. Third, information manipulation and legal prosecution of online users create an environment of control by redirecting movements, resources, and energy toward fighting smearing campaigns and court cases. In this way, digital repression can help government avoid indiscriminate use of force, or to refer to my earlier argument that the violent use of force to repress protesters. So in this way, repression can be bloodless and sanitized. As a result, nonviolent characteristics of movement cannot increase audience costs because you know, in other words, repression becomes so-called non-violent. Let us turn to the Thai case in order to elaborate this theoretical observation. Now, in a nutshell, before I talk in details about the protests in focus in this talk, in a nutshell, Thai politics has been dominated by the monarchy and the military that staged at least 13 successful coups, with the latest one in 2014. These institutional roots have prevented sustainable democratic development in the country. And so mass demonstrations that broke out in 2020 and 2021 marked a historical turning point. Basically because it was the first major campaigns after the coup in 2014. It endured for many months, and it gained significant domestic and international traction. Particularly, the 2020 campaigns were primarily non-violent and very innovative, as young protesters mobilized in digital space and used diverse creative tactics to counter repression. Most importantly, youth activists broke the taboo regarding the monarchy by demanding the reform of these institutions. Now, for the regime, the campaigns targeting or criticizing the monarchy is actually a no-go. It is considered a threat to the status quo. And therefore, it has unleashed a series of offline repression, police crackdown, and all of that. But most importantly, the regime has tapped into various methods of digital repression that have been developed since 2000 and 2006. And so just to save us some time, I will not go into detail of how the ecosystem of digital repression in Thailand works, but just an idea. These are 4 methods that I explained earlier, and what we should highlight is the extent and the capabilities of digital surveillance in terms of providing crucial information for the authorities to enforce other methods of digital repression, including what content to block, including who to charge when it comes to posting critical online comments, and what kind of message they should manipulate online, right? And so at the top of the ecosystem of this repression stays the surveillance and increasingly advanced digital surveillance. Now, these tactics often work in tandem, and the regime relies on the combination of these tactics essentially to weaken the infrastructure of the movement in 2020 and 2021, and the impact of this repression still lingers today. And when the infrastructure of movement is undermined, weakened, this can actually prevent effective mobilization of resources and supporters. So in other words, the government doesn't have to stop the resistance as such. It can just lower the impact of the resistance. So first, And I summarize all of these processes of digital repression and its impact on mobilization in 2020 and 2021 based on my current research. It's not concluded yet, so this is just some of my takeaway from the ongoing research. So first, the use of spyware provided security forces exclusive insights into movements, logistical arrangement, plans for future activities, financial resources, and even internal conflicts. And so just to give you one, illustrative example, I interviewed someone who actually helped mobilize funding for movements, and she was quite careful in concealing her identity. And yet, this is not possible. Eventually, the government played catch up with her, and there was some legal consequence, even though this legal consequence is not directly about her role in the movement. So the information that's snooped by the spyware provide the security forces this very insightful, exclusive information to do other things. Now, as I said, this wealth of information buttress online influence campaigns that frame movement leaders as lacking moral integrity, a discourse that actually worsen rifts between different factions of the movement. So it's not just framing that, for example, portrays protesters as anti-nation or as not patriotic, but also just to sow doubt within leading figures of the movement. So that creates a major rift within movement. Then the same extent of information allows the authorities to identify movement supporters who have high social profile and did not want to reveal their identities. This ability then led the authorities to slap these figures with legal charges, some of which are non-political, involving financial regulation, for instance. Other activists also faced serious lawsuits, even though they were quite sure that the evidence used for these lawsuits couldn't have been obtained without unlawful use of spyware. Now, last but not least, and this is just still a very, unpolished kind of theoretical thinking on my part, I conceptualize these dynamics of digital repression vis-a-vis resistance movements in terms of panoptic, punitive, and framing powers. Digital repression works to empower regimes with the ability to see and know it all. Extensive and exclusive information is then leveraged against dissidents by boosting punitive and framing powers. As a result, security forces do not need to unleash full force against activists, but they can just target only key figures that facilitate the operation of campaigns. Through the piling of lawsuits against these figures, and mind you, this is not just one or two lawsuits an activist face. The maximum of lawsuits I've heard can be up to 60 court cases, and okay, you spend every day fighting these law cases, these lawsuits. Through the piling of lawsuits against these figures, the repression is done bloodlessly, non-violently, in the name of the law. Repressive actors are faceless as they are part of the system, the judiciary, and even ordinary citizens who report to police about legal violation by activists. What is more, the nexus between panoptic and framing powers creates mechanisms of social control as activists start to morally police one another and self-censor what they say online and in private. And right now, even when I speak on the phone with some activists, I have to make sure that I turn off my mobile phone in order to make sure that I'm not followed or my phone is not hacked. And so to conclude my presentation, which is a bit creepy for many, I do not want to end with a pessimistic pessimistic note. But as my research is ongoing, I can only suggest we as scholars of nonviolent resistance, we rethink the relationship of nonviolent resistance and advanced repression, and get more creative in terms of reversing detrimental impact of digital repression. So I'll end my presentation here.